Hey, I'm Race, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how you can go about recording and engineering modern mid and high gain sounding guitars.
Just let it go. Unveil the inside, bring it to light. No more hiding what's inside.
Specifically, I'm going to talk within the context of the clip you just heard, which is the chorus of our song Placid. I'll play that for you again with the vocals muted. That's a very guitar forward mix, and I made that decision after the fact because the first thing that I recorded and decided to track was this synth bus, which, as you can hear, is pretty low mid heavy. You can even look on the EQ curve that there's quite a bit of low mid information, and I actually had to do some EQ moves here to help tamp that down a little bit because it was clashing with the bass. First things first, I want to show you what the raw tone sounds like. Now, obviously, this is going through my master bus, but I just want to show you what went right into the interface when I pressed record. All right, I actually have the preset that I had going on my Axe 8 when I was recording. It's a relatively straightforward preset. The gate's doing virtually nothing. You could just as easily use the input gate that comes with all the presets on the Axe 8. And the compressor is really just to catch some of the peaks and even out the single note playing. So most of the work that's going on right now is happening in the amp, which, as you can see, is an AC Class A style amp. I think for this genre, having quite a bit of mid-range presence is very valuable. I think it helps you cut a lot in a mix, and it really accentuates the character of the amp that you're playing. I'm not going to go through every setting that I've made, but I wanted you guys, if you have an Axe 8 or another Fractal Audio Systems product, to at least be able to see what I'm doing on the front end of the amplifier. So there's nothing too crazy going on here. Most of the processing is going to be coming from the front panel of the amp. You don't really need to worry too much about the rest of these until you've dialed in a tone that is pretty pleasing to your ears and you need to make more specific moves. By that time, though, if you're looking to record, I would recommend leaving a little bit more going in so that you can have more to work with in the DAW. Now that I've shown you the tones soloed and you've gotten to see what the preset settings are, I'll talk a little bit about the EQ moves that I'm making. And I want to emphasize that all of the plugins that you'll be seeing me use on the guitar bus today are going to be totally free. They either come in the Reaper plugin suite or are externally available for no cost to you. This style of guitar tone, which is a little bit more mid-gain and a little bit brighter, is very evocative of some of the newer, more progressive instrumental guitar music that's been coming out lately in the form of Polyphia or Chon or even some of Ollie Steele's solo material. When I find myself reaching for a tone like this, it's typically for a part in a song that requires the guitars to cut rather than fill. And given that I have so much low mid information going on from the multiple layers of synths, I felt that I wanted the guitars to help drive the chorus without necessarily muddying it up. In line with what I said, you can see that a lot of the low mids are being cut out of these guitars. And even though it's already a relatively bright and scooped sound, I wanted to make sure that I could accentuate those frequencies. Now I'm going to solo this left crunch channel, and I'll bypass all of the effects and slowly turn one on at a time so you can hear what each individual effect is doing. All right. Essentially, the flow of plugins runs in my mind like this. My initial plugin is trimming the top end I don't need and trimming the bottom end I don't need. From my perspective, anything below 90 to 120 hertz on a guitar is really unnecessary information and is just going to get in the way of the bass. So I tend to high pass that. That can be mutable if we're working with down-tuned or heavier guitars or you're working in a gent genre, and we'll cover that in a future video. For now, I high pass at 90. I'm low passing quite high up, but I actually have a second instance of a more aggressive low pass going on. I like to stack high passes and low passes on tones like this because this isn't true infinity, and even though it looks like there's nothing going on below 50 hertz, if I go to the second instance of the plugin, you can hear that there is in fact still sound coming through here, and you really don't need that. I don't always stack high passes and low passes, but In this particular section, especially considering that the guitars are going to be cutting a lot, I didn't really want to have very much low end information at all. And it's a very bright sound already, so it needed a bit more of an aggressive low pass. Finally, and this is just a lifesaver plugin, I strongly recommend you look into it. Even if you're not running Reaper as your chosen DAW, the RIA plugin suite is totally free, and I think it's worth it, obviously because it's free, but it's totally worth it for this plugin alone. The Tilt EQ has saved me a countless tracks. When you end up recording a sound or a tone that you think is really, really great in the moment, and come to realize that, unfortunately, within the context of a mix, it's just a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark, the Tilt EQ really takes the guesswork out of fixing a tone like that. It's a small sculpting tool, but you can do a lot with it. Essentially, all it's doing is picking a point on a parametric EQ curve and then tilting the EQ. It's really just, I'm pretty sure what's going on in the box is there's two shelves that are equally increasing and decreasing on either side of the selected point. I'm pretty sure it's a linear increase as well, not like a logarithmic one. And it's boosting anything above, or in this case, it's cutting anything above 639 hertz and boosting anything below that. The effect is essentially you're just creating the same tone. Everything else stays the same. All the rest of the EQ profile is identical. It's just a little bit darker. And I'll bypass that just so you can hear what happens when I turn it on. You can probably immediately tell that it's a lot less abrasive and a lot less fatiguing on the ears. That's something that you should really be conscious of, especially when we're double tracking guitars that are distorted like this. There's a lot of high-end harmonic information that can sound really great. And in fact, I imagine that some of you really like the sound of this guitar with no processing. Essentially, it can just become very fatiguing for a mixed forward instrument like a guitar to have a ton of accentuated top end and high mid frequencies, which sound great on their own, but can really get a little bit pokey. The same's true with a lot of low end. It probably sounds great isolated, but at the end of the day, when we're panning stereo, hard left and hard right, we're just muddying up all that sub bass and bass frequencies that the kick and the bass really want to occupy. You'll notice on the guitar bus, there's mostly just various stages of EQ. I've got a high and a low shelf running into some various pretty broad cuts and a high pass here. I've got another high pass on the second instance, and then this is the first instance of my low pass. Most of these decisions are going to be made to taste. In general, the most common problem areas for a guitar are the low mids, which can add to a lot of muddiness between 2 and 700 hertz, and the high mids, which can add to a lot of pokiness or brightness, and that's between 2 and 5K. After the EQ decisions are made and you've got the tone shaped where you want it to be, I think that this plugin or any type of plugin that runs similarly is paramount in cleaning up a guitar sound. This is a multi-band compressor. All a multi-band compressor does is create various tone bands which an individual compression algorithm listens to. Each of these compressors has various parameters you would see on a normal compressor. So by using the multiband, instead of having to turn to an EQ plugin to help rein in some of these problematic low-end frequencies, which you've probably already begun to cut, you can just run individual compressors which listen to just these specific frequency bands and then set the according ratio and thresholds to help tamp them down. Without the multiband compressor and just the EQ, you'll notice there's a lot of low-end information. The tone sounds great, but to me at least, it's a little bit muddy. It's all pretty much to taste, but in order to get the sound to be where I wanted it to be in my head, I threw this multiband on. I tend to lean towards this plugin a lot because it's a multiband that also shows a live frequency feed of the tone that's being fed through it, which really helps you kind of hone in exactly where you want these bands to sit. A really common trick with a multiband compressor is to only have one of these bands active and have it aggressively compress the frequencies that become boosted when one palm mutes a heavier or lower tuned guitar. That way we don't have to subtract those frequencies using an EQ. We can simply allow them to exist but control them and not allow them to get above a certain dB threshold. I'm not going to talk too much about the specific parameters of this multiband compressor. That'll be for a future video, but in general know that most of the use I'm getting out of it is to help rein in the low and low mid frequencies. Now I'll show you what the tone sounds like with the multiband on and bypassed. You can probably hear that it's a little bit less woofy and there's a little bit more clarity, especially when I'm going to the larger arpeggiated sections that have a low note ringing out on top of the brighter, twinklier top end. I thought this section was really good to talk about, not just because I think the part's really cool or I think the tone's really awesome, but because towards the end of the song, we repeat the chorus for a third time. But in this instance of the chorus, I wanted to add an extra guitar that served a completely different function. Right before this chorus section, there's a really big and impactful section with a very heavy guitar going on that's doing a very staccato pattern. And leading from that section into the chorus, I felt like I lost a little bit of momentum when I lost the dirty guitars. I'll let you hear what it sounds like. As you can probably hear, it feels like a lot of the bottom end gets sucked out of the guitar tone. And we do go back to another bright and full sounding chorus with the synths, but I wanted to close the song out a little bit stronger. So I double tracked, or in this case, I would call it quad tracked, the chorus guitar lines, this time using a much more distorted sound. And even just looking at the EQ graph, you'll see there's a lot more low mid information. And this ties back into what I was talking about earlier with the multiband. When we're using a lot higher gain guitars, typically we'll also notice a spike in those low mids. But this was really pleasing for me because when we get to this final chorus, I'm not just relying on the synths to fill out. I have an extra guitar that's playing the same line as my crunch guitar, but with a totally different tone that functions in a totally different way. I think over affecting or trying to throw a secret sauce on a guitar tone is a common tendency for a home producer, but ultimately you should let the tone that you created and the tone that inspired you to write the part speak in this section. You shouldn't subtract everything away or change it. That's all I have for now. In the future, I'm going to talk more about how I dialed in the tone that I tracked and wrote this part with, and I'll break down the actual theory and composition of the part. Thank you.